diversionary tactics. 2 months later, early 2263, 3 days after Caesar arrived at the Long Shadows fortress, the entire fourth cohort was marching east into the vast wilderness of Hydebark territory, an open, mountainous land east of Tucson that was always home to those who never backed down from a fight against even the mightiest who invaded it. The land gave birth to the kind of warriors like Geronimo and his raiders over 300 years prior, and by the start of 2263, the land was occupied by an equally if not more formidable foe to its past inhabitants. Descended from the native inhabitants of southeastern Arizona and the scattered survivors from the 2077 Armageddon, the land-bred people made for conflict, and those who took defeats as motive for retribution. Whether it was Apaches against Mexicans, lawmen against outlaws, or soldiers against native legends, the sands in this part of the Sonoran Waste had blood spilled into it for hundreds if not thousands of years. But this was the day of the Legion. Now the land was engulfed in an inferno like never before. The Crimson Horde moved into the land once again, ready to pick up where the Legate failed and finally put down the land's inhabitants for good. The Legion marched further east, headed by Caesar himself, and seconded by the elite who dreaded the same fate as the late Legate Marius. With the remnants of the fifth cohort back in Long Shadows, the hired auxilia of the Interfector largely stayed behind, ready to defend against any potential regional enemies that may try to harm the settlers that swore to Caesar. Though the timing of the Interfector side project was executed perfectly, the elite was nervous about the advance into Hydebark territory. After all, Legate Marius was no fool when it came to warfare, although it was believed that pride got the better of him during his failed campaign against the Hydebarks. Years of warfare up north prepared the Legate for many kinds of tribal enemies, but the Hydebarks' refusal to fight in the open led to a terrible guerrilla campaign that ultimately led to his suicide. The image of what Marius did to himself haunted the Interfector on the march east, but everything the elite told Caesar about the failures of Marius was taken into consideration, and the adaptations of the Legion were tried in experiment during this second campaign. Those first days of the march east were slow and uneventful until the Hydebarks that watched Legate Marius return to Long Shadows in humiliation were alerted by the sight of the new force, fully equipped for another war. After those first days, the Hydebark attacks were light and calculated before the savage assaults on the marching column began. Feeling accomplished by what they did to the prior Legion forces, their first victories against the new force were worthy of celebration until the Legion did something the soldiers under Marius didn't. Legate Marius led a nearly continuous march towards Hydebark villages, only for Hydebark scouts to send word to their forces, who led diversionary attacks to buy their people more time to pack up and move their settlements to new locations in the region's hills and cliffs. By the time the forces under Marius arrived at these village sites, they'd already moved out while their warriors did everything they could to whittle the Legion's numbers down for weeks at a time. All those advances and continuous marches to nothing destroyed the Legate's forces, and so an altered approach was adopted. The fourth cohort under Caesar took those first defeats in stride and developed a simpler but unexpected tactic of setting up shop in the Hydebark lands. Caesar had a fortress constructed in the middle of their enemies' lands as an act of defiance to the Hydebark ambush strategy. As stated previously, the Hydebarks excelled at hitting Legion columns and even camps, but a walled encampment made the weapons of tribal warriors obsolete. Of course, the tribals saw this construction effort and panicked, giving Caesar something that they refused to give Legate Marius, an actual battle. When the cohort repelled the Hydebark assault on their construction project, it wasn't more than a few days later that the fortification was operational. Even though the new fort was hastily built and lacking the sort of accommodations of Long Shadows, the thing was built over a great area in the desert with plentiful edible plant life and nearby creatures that made the kind of logistics of Marius's mobile horde unnecessary. With the cohort establishing a firm foothold in the region, the Hydebark attacks still happened, but the enemy quickly learned to change tactics themselves. Lacking the tools and equipment to take on the fort directly, the Hydebarks knew the Legion well and knew they were only in the area to destroy the tribe. It is because of this that the Legion was no longer just a giant mobile force waiting to be ambushed. Their fort allowed them to have an anchored spot in the region where mobile strike forces could be dispersed throughout the territory. Due to this tactic, the Hydebarks had to break up their forces as well in order to hit each Legion formation as they started a search and destroy campaign against Hydebark settlements. The dispersal of well-equipped Legion strike forces across the region proved very successful at the start, with 3 Hydebark villages falling in the first weeks of the second month. But the Legion had yet to find the main tribal village, or home of their chief and elders. The only downside of these victories was the fact that Hydebark warriors became even more vicious when they watched what happened to their people at the hands of the Legion. Hydebarks from all over the territory got to see many of their people get slaughtered, with only few taken back to the Legion's new fort. It was very clear to the enemy with these first victories that the Legion only really intended to have their people destroyed, an act of terror that strengthened resolve on the Hydebark side. Despite this, Caesar knew that the Hydebarks would completely crumble if they managed to find and capture their tribal leadership, which was something that made those previous victories almost irrelevant towards the campaign's progress, and not necessarily indicative of the Legion's motive toward the Hydebarks as a whole. Nearing the end of that second month, the Hydebarks saw their losses and became even more paranoid that the next village to fall would be the one that ended their people completely. It is here, during the search for the Hydebark chief and elders, that the story of our duelists picks up. Now, this next part of our story is vague and may not even be accurate, but not a whole lot is known about Legion history at this point, especially given the peculiarity of this particular moment in their rise. It is believed that this campaign against the Hydebarks is shrouded in mystery for a reason, and that is because of how legends in general tend to work. The Legion was very secretive of their history and stories, but some find it curious, or at least worth considering, the results of this campaign, since it appears to be where 2 separate Legion legends bleed into one another. Consider it true or don't, but some have said that the duelists themselves were almost directly responsible for the emergence of a new legend that would one day overshadow their own. On one cold morning in early 2263, Caesar was walking the grounds of the territorial fortress with his elite. "I have 34 of my legionaries too wounded to fight, and it's been over a week since the last Hydebark village was razed. I demand to know what you're doing about this, Centurion," said Caesar to his second. "My lord, I have all your ready forces out in the wilderness, each accompanied by trackers from Tucson." The elite was interrupted by Caesar. "I don't want to hear about those scum you hired to serve me. It is because of those dissolute mercenaries that those goddamn stories about some giant are spreading. My lord, if I may, those trackers are the reason we're closer than ever to finding the remainder of the enemy leadership. I've focused the bulk of your forces into the south for exactly as you said. The resistance out that way certainly indicates a Hydebark panic about what we'll find in those cliffs." "Either that or yet another diversion," shouted the dictator. "You mobilized half of the cohort's legionaries into the south when that's exactly what they want. You better hope that these losses amount to something tangible, because now the east and west are almost completely unwatched. For all we know, the chieftains are setting up in the east, while the forces you sent south are doing nothing but dying. I understand, Lord Caesar, but I do have the majority of our auxilia filling in the gaps I made when relocating the legionaries southward. As if I can rely on anyone under auxilia, hired or otherwise. So far during this campaign, they've done nothing but talk more about that fictitious Hydebark monster and flee from Hydebark raiders under the guise of scouting operations. I have remedied that, my lord. I have attached each auxilia unit to veteran or prime detachments of your legionaries. The auxilia groups are supported completely by experienced soldiers to compensate for the relocation of our predominantly lower veterancy-based battle groups in the southern hot zone. What orders have you given to those gap fillers in the east and west? Well, for example, I have 4 senior officers from the 6th leading one group in the east, while Centurion Armand and Lucania lead the effort in the south. If you suspect the chieftain relocation to the east or even west, I do in fact have eyes out that way to monitor for an... And what do you intend to do if your auxilia-backed watchers encounter a village march in places where our forces are too busy in the south? We have to do what we can with the losses and address each situation with tact as they arise. but each Auxilia veteran group is under orders to stay put and send word of any assaults or movements of civilian forces and any of their zones of operation, while Veteran and Prime Contubernia are under the Standard Pursuit Order. Do you think they can mobilize the Southern Relocation Legionaries in time if something urgent was seen? Inquired the dictator, still frustrated by the situation, but choosing to believe his subordinate's competency for the moment. I have all the faith in the world and the Twisted Hairs runners to do what's needed, and provided one of the groups from the west or east can back up any section that encounters civilian movements. I see no issue even if we have to rapidly move away from the southern battle zone. At the same time, and nearly 15 miles east of the Legion territorial fortification, Alaron marched at the head of the formation, right next to Decanus Gula and the 6th century signifer Decanus Montano. It was unusual for Alaron to be out on the march like that, being part of the Interfector's personal guard, let alone with his rival. But the situation described in the sections above led to unique variations of Legion tactics. Since the elite took the head of the cohort's entire Auxilia surplus, the Auxilia were split into groups to bolster Legion strike forces across the region, while a bulk of the forces were diverted south to confront the heavy resistance out that way. Because of the many mobile strike forces scattered across the region, communication and leadership were key, so Alaron was charged with leading 30 Auxilia soldiers, most of whom were atomic stalkers alongside the strike group's veteran legionaries. Decanus Gula was leading the 20 veteran legionaries of the strike group, accompanied by Montano, who the 6th century's veterans looked up to, especially when the man was bearing the role of a Vexillarius. Marching the endless dirt paths in this land that civilization ignored or time erased, the trek was slow for the past 2 days, making each soldier, Auxilia, and legionary crave the kind of battle that had been happening in the south for nearly 3 days at that point. It was late in the morning when it finally happened. The roughly 50-man strike group was marching along a path in the midst of open desert towards a series of cliffs in the east, when the first shots came from a sand dune on the unit's left. Like lightning, the veterans on the outer ranks of the column dropped their packs and fired a spree of retaliatory shots as a volley of spears and rifle fire came from the Auxilia making up the center. The dust flared up and began covering the area as more gunshots came, and several soldiers collapsed in the ambush. Montano moved towards the center, bearing the flag on his back as Gula ordered the veterans to storm the sand dune. The veterans swarmed from the ranks past Montano, who pointed a pistol at a retreating Hydebark dot in the distance. As the veterans moved up the dune, he almost started sprinting forward to lead and join them in pursuit of the ambushers, when he noticed the Auxilia's gunfire fading to a stop behind him. Why weren't the Auxilia joining the veterans' pursuit? When the last of the veterans disappeared over the dune, another series of distant gunshots erupted beneath the noise of a minor brawl. Montano whipped around to see the Auxilia troops hadn't left the formation and were treating injuries or collecting themselves while Alaron and Gula were talking to one another. Montano stormed towards Gula and Alaron, still hearing the distant noise of the veteran pursuers. What is the meaning of this? Why aren't these Auxilia bolstering the veterans in pursuit? Alaron and Gula turned towards Montano as a Twisted Hairs runner stepped up, and Alaron said, "I am under orders to relay message of attacks first before anything, and to keep Auxilia intact." As Alaron turned his attention to the Twisted Hair scout, Montano interrupted. "Your orders are to bolster our legionaries before anything else. That is the entire point of Auxilia." Gula had faced Montano with a face that would have said, "Leave this be," if it wasn't for the mask he wore. Alaron had finished giving directive to the Twisted Hair scout, who started running west when he turned back to Montano. "My method of Auxilia utilization comes strictly from Lord Interfector." Still hearing the fighting on the other side of the dune, Gula said, "The situation will be handled a prop," but was interrupted by Alaron, who said to Montano murderously, "Stay in your realm of authority. Signifer, I am in charge of this Auxilia, not you. I will lead them according to directive." As the threat and display of authority entered Montano's ears, Alaron gave a brief order for the Auxilia to line the top of the dune and offer sheltered ranged support. When the words of Alaron really sank in, Montano said to Alaron, "It would be you to shy away from a fight and subvert your true responsibilities when leading an Auxilia." Alaron removed his goggles as the Auxilia lined the top of the dune and began helping the veterans with prone ranged fire. Aileron looked to the dune and source of gunshots before looking back at Montano. Gula flashed his gaze between the two before authoritatively stating, "Don't," but it was too late. Aileron heard the insult from that man and replied, "And it would be you to shirk your responsibility of leading a veteran charge as of Excelarius, only to obstruct the directives of a centurion." Memories of the very first duel almost exactly 1 year prior clouded both men's minds. Aileron was acting under orders, and Montano didn't much care for the order when he felt it got in the way of adequately serving Caesar. And then to be accused of shirking responsibility when his love of Caesar was used against him like a weapon. Still, neither man could or would stand for insult, no matter the situation, especially when there was the implication of cowardice on both sides. This time, Aileron was the first to initiate the action when he drew his gun and aimed it at Montano. In a flash, Montano had done the same, and Gula screamed, "I'll have both of you killed." Neither man heard those words as the guns continued to pop off to the north along that dune, not because of the noise, but because their worlds were lost in their hate for the other yet again. With both men ignoring Gula, the two stated, "You're dead," simultaneously to one another as they both started walking south from the ambush site and combat zone. Gula stayed put and drew his weapon, aiming at both of them as they continued to walk south. "Caesar is back at camp. You two will die for this." Neither man said anything, even as Gula put a shot between them to say he was serious. The two disappeared down a small path south of the ambush site and battle zone, not even caring about the lack of witnesses for this upcoming duel, or about the charges Gula was currently preparing in his mind. Gula knew there was no stopping them unless he killed them outright, but then he'd have to explain why neither of them returned from the ambush honestly. That honesty would likely never even reach Caesar, since he'd have to report to Thericos, who'd then have to report the situation to the Interfector. If the incident actually went past the Interfector, who'd authorized their conflicts for months, Gula relished the idea of both men being crucified. Though he was unsure if the Interfector would even punish such an event, Gula deemed the situation in the middle of another battle to be enough to get the elite's attention again, especially if Caesar heard about it. As strange as the elite was, he would most likely have the two's feud settled on a pair of crosses, especially since it was during a battle, and on a front where Caesar was breathing down the elite's neck. If this duel really was the final duel, the victor wouldn't get to celebrate for too long, since Gula felt sure that even the Interfector would see to his end when under pressure from Caesar. However, the fates of the duelists were left for another day, because not even 15 minutes after the two disappeared down the southern slopes, the two found themselves with a witness to their mutual combat they didn't expect. When the two found the 13-year-old Heidelberg boy down a set of narrow passes south of the ambush site, all their rage for one another disappeared in an instant as Montano and Aileron gagged and bound him before he could scream. Wondering where they were, they saw the herd of young bighorners around the restrained boy and hauled him to the edge of the southern cliff. From the safety of the hidden sheep trail, the two looked out over a large encampment of Heidelbergs, nestled in the bottom of the open ravine. The entire village of what looked to be around 300 to 400 Heidelberg enemies went about their business, quiet as the grave, and seemingly unaware of the duelists on the cliff top. Before the duel had started, it ended when they found that hidden Heidelberg home, and the Heidelberg tactics made sense to both men as they looked over the scene. Gula took charge of the auxilia and pursuing veterans, doing his best to balance both the pursuit orders of the veterans and the stay-put orders for Aileron's auxilia, still planning how to have Aileron and Montano killed. 15 minutes after the two departed, the veterans were still tailing the Heidelberg force north, not knowing it was only a diversion away from the hidden Heidelberg village in their immediate south. Although between them was Aileron's group of auxilia, ready to relay word of civilian movements and report on any attacks. Though Gula had no idea there was a whole Heidelberg village less than 15 minutes south of the ambush site, the legionaries continued to take the bait moving north before Gula called them back to regroup and wait to detain the victor of the duel. Montano slit the young herder's throat silently as he said, "I'll stay here," and began watching the village from a rocky overlook. Aileron said plainly, "I'll send word," and began running up the rocks back the way they came. When Gula saw the lack of blood on Aileron upon returning, he screamed at him for answers. But Aileron, instantly ordered the atomic stalkers to start pursuing the diversion force so as to not raise suspicion that they found something. Gula still demanded answers, but had the arresting veterans release their grip on him when Alaron gave 3 separate orders to the auxiliary runners. Send word to Dalton the Prime's force to rally with us here. Have Centurion Lucania's force put on standby for relocation from the south. And lastly, find Lord Interfector back at the territorial fortress and tell him we found it. Gula didn't know what it was exactly that Alaron and apparently Montano found, and neither did they. Although, as the auxiliary runners set off, Alaron told Gula that he and his rival discovered a village. It was unknown whether or not the village they found was the campaign's primary target, but those 3 orders were the ones that meant business. When Alaron, Gula, and the veterans arrived at the scene and regrouped with Montano, they still didn't know if the village they saw was the one that'd end the war against the Hydebarks. But that didn't matter at the time, since it was still a settlement of people that needed to be dealt with. By the end of the day, the Auxilia had chased the Hydebark diversionary force far enough and returned to the ambush site, where they met with 2 other nearby strike groups that had moved on the scene after hearing from Alaron's messengers. There, the 3 strike groups arrived on those cliffs overlooking the hidden camps. Upon arrival, the large force of combined strike groups could hide their presence no more, and all the eyes in that hidden Hydebark camp looked up at those cliffs to find they'd been discovered and surrounded. As the sun disappeared below the western mountains, the Interfector heard from Alaron's messenger and was on his way east, directly behind Caesar himself. The Hydebarks attacked the duelist group from the north, feeling that the Legion would pursue, thus keeping their village safe in the south. If it wasn't for duelists trying to find privacy for their mutual combat, the Hydebarks' home near the ambush site would have flown completely under the radar. And what happened next probably would have been delayed by months or never even happened at all. The 30th Arrow. 12 days later. When the available strike groups arrived on the scene our duelists discovered, they did so with the other groups that got word first. As stated previously, the Hydebarks in that hidden village didn't know they'd been discovered until it was far too late. When the Interfector got word, Caesar had been informed at the same time, and more forces were moved on it while keeping that battle going in the south. Before the Hydebarks could pack up and move, they were being watched by almost all the available strike groups who weren't occupied in the southern battle zone, and when they realized this, they sent what few messengers they could out before they were completely surrounded. Sending out these messengers ended up being an enormous mistake on their part, because it sealed their end as the encircling legionaries began digging trenches and erecting barricades around the village. When those messengers reached their forces across the region, all of them were recalled, and the forces keeping distraction on the south began fleeing, allowing for easy Legion capture. Those messengers essentially pleaded for backup in that their chief and elders had been discovered. The village that would have flown under the radar and been considered any other Hydebark mobile camp had its cover blown as the leadership's home because of that mass recall of their warriors. This was it. The chieftains were surrounded, and all of their returning forces fled straight and disorganized into the Legion blockade made by those local strike groups, with the mass of Legion forces cleaning up after their surprisingly abrupt victory in the southern battle zone. It wasn't too long until the Hydebark warriors who'd made it to the small siege line got sandwiched by the Legion's main force that quickly mobilized from the south. Where the Legion found themselves was with a whole lot of captured warriors and surrounding a few hundred civilians trapped in their home, though the Legion didn't know they were laying siege to the leadership's home on arrival. The return and subsequent capture of all those Hydebarks trying to help was what gave the first clue to Caesar that this was nearly over. Despite the war against the Hydebarks being nearly over, the Hydebarks were a proud people that had no intention of surrendering to anyone. Of the few warriors that were protecting the village before the siege, it was clear from the moment they knew they were found that even those in camp never intended to give up on that first day. Not even on that second day, when the first captives of their returning ambush parties were displayed on the cliffs, holding white cloths. It wasn't even on that third and fourth day when their warriors keeping attention on the south were brought to those same cliffs, again holding white flags and begging their chiefs to surrender. It was on day 5 when the first Legion emissary was sent down into the village, only to return with a refusal and without a head. The chief of the Hydebarks was the responder to the message, and that was also when the sign came up. When Caesar learned that the head chief himself was in the village, and after seeing what was done to his envoy, he still intended to deal with the situation diplomatically. A large sign was made on the section of the Legion line, housing the leadership that said, Hidba'a kifo onu mortiaka, or roughly translated to Hyde-Bark leaders will be spared if only they'd surrender. The Hyde-Bark response to this was to send an attack forward directly at the encircling Legion force. This was surprising because it was believed to be mostly women and children in the camp, but that was only partially true and didn't account for the fact that even Hyde-Bark women and able children were also more than willing to fight when their warriors couldn't. The force was repelled, and the siege line's walls were constructed a little higher with the bodies of the dead. What Caesar saw as his very own siege of Alesia was taking place, and he admired the resolve of their leaders, so the sign stayed up, even as his leniency failed, and the surrendered warriors were slowly executed before the Hyde-Bark's eyes. After the failed assault on the Legion's line, Caesar's patience was gone, and day 6 started with a group of captives falling lifeless from those cliffs. When the bodies fell, the only answer from the surrounded village was a lone arrow in the large sign, shot by a single figure from the middle of the camp. With the executions happening to 3 or 4 captives 5 times a day since the failed assault, it was easy to see a pattern. 5 days and 25 new arrows had pelted the sign, and all from the same large figure at the bottom of the valley. Each attempt to demoralize the tribe was met by that one giant with a bow, apparently showing the chieftain's response to the scene. What was interesting to all at the time was how that lone figure never moved, even as the injured around him moved about, or people were collapsing from lack of water and food. More bodies fell from the cliffs, and there was no clear sign that the Hyde-Barks ever intended to surrender if what that giant kept doing to the sign was any indication. On the 11th day, another envoy was sent telling complete destruction if the chieftains didn't surrender on the 13th day. The response from the message was never received since the envoy was on his way back when he was dropped to the ground by that bow-wielding giant. It was only when the giant walked closer to the line to retrieve his arrow and then mutilate the corpse that many legionaries got a closer look at him. Caesar was waiting for the envoy to arrive at the edge of the line when his praetorians formed a wall in front of him for protection. Caesar had them stand down and halt the legionaries in range as the giant approached and began his work. Caesar stared at that Hyde-Bark giant in wonder, somehow knowing that man could kill him with another arrow, but never would. Just as he thought, Caesar watched that monster yank the long arrow out of the envoy, destroy the body with a large axe, and when he was done, the giant threw the envoy's head so far it nearly landed at Caesar's own feet. It was then that he walked back to the village, back to the same spot, ready to put one more arrow in the sign whenever the next batch of warriors fell. It was on the night of the 12th day of the Legion's small siege that our story resumes. In only a few more hours, it was going to be the 13th day, and the Hyde-Barks would have to either surrender or be destroyed. Little did they know, both answers led to the same outcome, just by different means. The Interfector poured a bit of water on his cloth as he dabbed the doctor's eye. I told you it ain't a good idea to talk to Caesar unless he talks to you first. Those Praetorians are very serious around him. I just corrected what you were telling him about the status of our injured, said Dr. Stinson, wincing at the elite's careful work. Yeah, and he was talking to me about that. Not you, Doc. I thought you'd know by now that he isn't just a guy you can say words to whenever, said the elite as he picked residue away from the doctor's swollen shut eyelid. The doctor, largely collected by this point, said, still, those Praetorians didn't have to do all that, as he recalled his merciless pummeling by 4 sunglasses-wearing gentlemen only 30 minutes earlier. And they would have done a lot more if Caesar wasn't so irritated by your shouting, replied the Interfector as he placed 3 more gold coins on the little table next to the doctor. Upon hearing the jingle, Dr. Stinson gently pushed the elite's hand away as he made eye contact with the man. Look, we gotta talk about my terms. Shoot, said the murderer as he got back to work on the other side of the doctor's head. When I signed on, I thought you said I'd mostly be staying back at Long Shadows. Change of plans, I know. But look, these past couple months ain't been that bad for you. Scrubbing around the open part of the doc's head, the Interfector added, you just gotta stop getting the shit kicked out of yourself. You alone are going to bankrupt me. I'll say again, you don't gotta keep paying me so generously. I'm already able to probably buy 2 sun itself when I get back, responded the doctor, feeling somewhat ashamed of his conduct and how many bruises it has caused, but still remaining thankful for the amount of money he's been getting. Well, stop getting beat up. I sort of feel like I have to compensate you each time since I feel so bad. And I appreciate that, Lord Interprimus. But I just gotta say it now. I didn't really sign up for all this. So, after this, I think I'm done. You can go as soon as we return back to Long Shadows, and I'll completely understand. No hard feelings. Plus, this campaign against the Hydebarks is almost done, and I'm not sure we'll treat too many of them. Unless you want to take a look at that Hydebark giant's corpse after we take him out tomorrow. Not really feeling up to an autopsy, and I highly doubt that monster would need any of my expertise, even if he ends up getting beaten into a slave pen. I hadn't come across too many people who actually like being healed since entering your employment, neither tribals nor legionnaires. In fact, I prefer to get as far away from guys like him and guys like Predatorians as soon as possible. Yeah, the word wounded is almost a personal insult around here. Anyway, your work has been very appreciated, even if you don't hear it, and I'm sure I've compensated you adequately enough. Plus, now you can add battlefield experience to the old doctor reputation back home, joked the Interfector, before turning towards a rustling by his tent's opening. Just then, Dalton came into the Interfector's tent saying, "That makes 30. The murderer gave Dalton a nod as he rapped the doc's head, and asked, "The 30th arrow, huh? I suppose that's the last one till tomorrow when it's showtime." Dalton asked, "What's Caesar been waiting for anyway? These people won't surrender. At least that monster won't. I'll say we've been wasting our time since that first arrow hit the sign." I'm inclined to agree, but Caesar usually has interesting ways of handling this sort of thing. Plus, starving them out with this siege and breaking them down gets us a head start on the old assimilation routine. Either way, tomorrow should be exciting. I want to see that monster up close again. So does Doc. Ain't that right? Startled by his sudden draft into the conversation, Doc asked, "Who?" Dalton chuckled at the Doc's pulverized condition and unawareness as the murderer finished his rapping and slapped the man's back, saying, "I think you're about good to go. Get up, slugger. Quit taking all those beatings. I'll consider it a personal favor." The doctor nodded and scrambled out the entrance on command back to his healing tent. Hopefully for a slow night and without any other beatings from his employers, despite how lucrative they often end up being. The murderer and Dalton then took their seats by the fire for the night in. Montano had just finished ravaging Clara, or making sweet love to her, as she'd say, while he began dressing back into his uniform only. He sat there, still resting on the cot and dressing in his casual tunic and undergarments while his woman pulled the thin blanket up to cover herself. "It's freezing in here," said the woman, curling further into her blanket and body. Montano only responded, "Make a fire then." "I just want to cuddle up," was the woman's response, and was one Montano expected. Upon turning to the woman curled into the blanket and looking at him lovingly, he felt disgusted by the fact she was seemingly attempting to subvert a directive. "Make a fire," ordered Montano to indicate he was serious. Clara stood herself up, saddened that the man in no way shared her desires, but also used to his behaviors as she got out of the bed and approached the fire cage in the center of his personal tent. As she went about making a fire, adding the kindling, and setting up the appropriate log structure for an efficient fire, she was talking the entire time. She'd always do what she was told, even after her attempts at breaking through the man's iron skin fell short, and for some reason she'd always talk whenever he was near. Montano assumed she was talking to him, but never truly took time to listen as she told him about her day and what she did, or refreshed him on everything she'd been up to after he'd been gone multiple days. Montano recalled the fact that Clara almost never shut her mouth when they were alone, and found himself wondering how so many words could come out of one small mouth. As Montano sat there on the cot, he was still thinking about the woman's words, not what she was saying in particular, just the fact that she talked in general. What was especially bewildering to him was how he recalled her talking almost the entire time he was doing stuff to her as well. This, of course, wasn't unusual, but as the woman spoke at him while she made the fire, he figured she just enjoyed hearing her own voice. Some would call the slim young woman's voice sweet, but not Montano. He found her words to be rather irritating if he actually listened to them for too long. Then he began wondering if she would ever stop talking. Again, he wasn't even listening to her or participating in the conversation, but he could hear the sound and began to wonder if cutting her head off would cease the noise he found to be almost endless. He considered doing that, but refrained from it because he somehow imagined that even decapitation wouldn't stop her from moving her lips. Also, it would be hard to find time to decapitate her during tomorrow's busy day of annihilating the Hydebarks, and he was too spent from their previous activity to do it that night. This was something he regularly scheduled to do to her, but seemingly always failed to carry out due to some minuscule obstruction or another that always ended up being more urgent. As she continued talking and Montano kept thinking, he wondered why he even let her talk in the first place. She was a slave, so he could silence her if he treated her like any other slave, and with enough real abuse, but for some reason he never assaulted her, at least physically. He figured he refrained from harming her for talking for the same reason some wasters listen to old radio static or local stations that play the same 8 songs on repeat. It was just something irrelevant going on to create a false sense of companionship while you think about more important things. His mind drifted on, curious if any wasters out there destroy their radios if they won't turn off. As he again contemplated Clara's destruction, he began wondering why he even kept Clara around at all. Just as he thought that, the woman bent over to pick up another log for the fire, and he remembered. That's right. He somewhat admired her dumb obedience and willingness to put out on command. It should be quickly noted that Clara herself was a very smart woman, and though there were seemingly gaps in her logic and actions, her character was a unique one that will require later study. Thinking about the most recent encounter with his lover, he began considering the possibilities of getting another servant, perhaps one that Clara could make noise to as opposed to himself. Then he considered whether or not the new slave would have the same sexual desire and blind obedience Clara came with. Likely not, and creating the kind of slave like Clara the servant was a timely endeavor. The time and patience required to make another Clara would likely drive him to kill both of them. Unless he could skip that step, find himself a slave with the same sexual abilities as Clara, but did not speak all the time, and wasn't so scared of him that she'd just lay still during his ravagings. Did Clara have a sister? By the time he had this thought, Clara sat back down on the cot next to him and started putting her underwear back on. What was curious was the way she was looking at him while she redressed. Montano didn't realize this, but she was waiting for his answer to a question he didn't even hear. Still, Montano knew the cue from such a look, and though he didn't answer her question, he was still stuck on one particular thought and found himself asking, "Do you have a sister?" She squinted, perplexed by his non-answer to her question, but she still answered anyway. "I think so." Montano was still thinking. As much as he'd hate two Claras, he had to admit to himself that he would buy up her sister in a heartbeat if she had the same sexual skills and could take care of Clara number one's talking malfunction, as he considered it. For all he knew, he wouldn't even have to buy her sister, especially if she was one to blindly offer herself to servitude like Clara. In any event, Montano was snapped back to the moment when her answer to his question sank in. Montano looked at her. "How do you not know if you have a sister?" Her hand drifted over to and rested on his arm, and he let her for some reason when she replied. "A little over a year ago, my sister was on her way up to Gold Canyon to live with me after our mom died. But the trek up from Mexico isn't too safe, and I didn't get any more letters from her after the one saying she was on her way. I waited for her for months, but sorta gave up after all that business around what's left of the old civilized valley. I didn't really mind when the Legion showed up in Gold Canyon. After all, if it wasn't for what happened in Phoenix, I probably wouldn't have met you. Also, I know the Legion has been ridding all the trash in the southern wastes, so I'm hoping we come across my sister one of these days after the Hydebarks are through. Once you all start cleaning out the raiders, things will be a lot better in the south. It's like I know my sister is still alive. Like, I can feel it. But I'm almost certain she probably got abducted by a clan of raiders or something. That stretch from El Puerto to even Tucson is still so dangerous. Raquel is so smart, though. Like, I'm sure she's fine wherever she is, but Montano was still thinking about how Clara and her sister were exchanging letters and wondered how long she'd been able to read and write. This was news to him, and he considered how he'd perhaps been underutilizing Clara as a slave. Though the ability to read was something incredibly dangerous for a normal slave to have, he'd known slaves who'd been quite beneficial to Legion officers as scribes, people to write down beneficial information for the century. Montano considered this as Clara went on, and his thoughts returned back to the beginning when she again looked at him expectingly. He answered another question he didn't hear, recently reminded by the fact he didn't enjoy hearing her talk, let alone being asked questions. "You should write down your thoughts, servant." She looked at him silently for a moment. After almost too long of silence, her blank face grew a warm smile. She gripped his arm a little harder and leaned on his shoulder. Clara whispered into his ear and kissed his cheek. "That's a great idea. Then I'll know just what to say when I see her again. You do listen to me." Alaron watched the 30th arrow strike the sign and continue to wobble long after the bodies fell from those cliffs. The moon was high, and the world was still as the only sound to be heard was a distant training drum beating on the other end of the line. Alaron had seen the final arrow each night get shot since the sign came up because he posted himself right beside it each night in order to watch over the camp alongside the prime sentries of the night watch. This wasn't out of duty since his position kept him by the Interfector's side most days. At night, however, the Interfector preferred to be alone, so Alaron was dismissed to go about whatever he wanted, and this usually led him to the sign each night to watch the village below and wait until that last round of captives fell from the cliffs, just waiting for that arrow. When that final arrow came to a halt, Dalton gave Alaron a pat on the back and said, "There it is, the 30th arrow. I'm gonna tell Primus." Alaron nodded and turned back to the village as one of the prime sentries climbed up on a small ladder to remove the arrow. The young Decanus watched the village under the stars, but there wasn't much to see in the dark night. Fires gave their glow all along the ridge, marking the Legion line, but the village below was still dark, with the only real light down there coming from one medium-sized fire in the middle that didn't show much other than the silhouette of that hide-bark giant. Alaron thought he could make out some hide-barks moving someone to an enclosure and exit without the body. He couldn't tell whether or not that tent was where the hide-barks were storing their dead or injured. He'd seen bodies get hauled in there throughout each day, and knew the hide-barks were rapidly failing due to starvation and thirst. As more were dragged into that enclosure, the whole scene was just a background for what every set of Legion eyes was really looking at. That monster who still hadn't moved from the center of camp, and was still ready to give his answer whenever the hide-bar captives fell. As he watched the monster, he wondered what the plan was. Of course, he knew they were only a couple of hours from the 13th day when that final offer of surrender would need an answer. What was curious to Alaron was the fact that there hadn't been any plan he'd been made aware of. Though Alaron still hadn't been within 20 yards of Caesar, the elite kept Alaron and his staff well informed. Everyone still knew that they'd head down there sometime the next morning, but no plan or battle rehearsals had been issued to the entire surrounding force. His attention turned once more to that distant training drum, but he knew that was likely out of idleness. With the world still and calm as can be, Alaron focused back on the giant by that lone fire. Alaron saw what happened to both of Caesar's envoys, and watched that giant begin pacing back and forth, occasionally slapping the ground with his axe. For several minutes, the giant moved back and forth in the glow of the fire, surrounded by the dark world, and actively battling the edge of darkness with his axe when he felt he should. Each pace back and forth was punctuated by a series of savage swings at the ground. The beast lodged the blade deep into the earth, cranking the heavy axe out of it, and bring it back down again and again before beginning to walk back and forth again and again on a loop as the minutes drifted by. No matter what he did in psychosis, or how many times he slammed that axe into the ground, the fire continued to flicker while doing very little to keep the darkness beyond it at bay. The flame would burn forever, but always be surrounded by the night, and the arrows of defiance wouldn't do much to stop what the world intended. Alaron finally watched the giant remove the longbow from his back, snap it over his knee, and leave the spot he rarely left in days. The last arrow of the night, the last arrow of the war. Tomorrow was the day it would end, whether or not the hide-bark symbol of defiance wanted it. When Alaron returned to his tent, Gabriella stood in an instant, ready for her master's orders. Aileron stayed silent, but the slave continued to watch him go about undressing his armor and making sure the fire was large enough for the night. Gabriella continued to watch her master's feet, knowing not to look at his face unless asked and still be ready for any demands. Aileron usually had Gabriella do something upon returning to his domicile for any menial chore, but he had been unusually silent most nights after returning from his observances over the line. Finally, Aileron laid himself down on his cot and shut his eyes as Gabriella still stood awaiting a directive, but Aileron was occupied with his mind. He wasn't thinking about any one thing in particular, just going over the myriad of things he'd done and seen throughout the day. This occupied him for a long while, until he could feel the servant still standing and looking in his direction, waiting for an order to do some chore or even to go to sleep. Aileron turned his head and opened his eyes to see the woman standing there beside her cot and still looking in his general direction. He could feel her waiting, and finally indulged her as he continued thinking about his afternoon. "You may speak." The woman looked up from the chest beneath his cot to meet his face as she asked timidly, "Would master have me do anything for him?" Aileron thought for a long moment, and the woman resumed looking at the chest beneath him. With Aileron's mind now chronologically running through the late afternoon activities, he said something to her that she wasn't expecting at all, nor him for that matter. The question came idly and unexpectedly from Aileron's mouth. "How did you get your name?" The servant, taken aback by the question, took a second to respond, not knowing how exactly to answer. Finally, she answered softly, "Master Aileron gave me my name." Aileron again thought for a long moment, admiring her obedience-based answer, but he knew that wasn't the truth. As he turned back to look up at the ceiling and, eventually his eyelids, he said, "No, I allowed you to keep it, but where does your name come from? You had it in your former tribe. I want to know why you were given your name." The decanus was now thinking about the night, and his time by the elite side right before being dismissed for the evening. Gabriella again wasn't sure what to say, having never been asked anything related to her being since being swallowed by Legion servitude. So, she finally answered cautiously, The name comes from a story of my former people." She waited. Aileron finally closed his eyes as he felt his servant still standing beside her cot. He very briefly recalled his own name and how he got it, something that he'd long forgotten. All he remembered was that his name was loosely derived from a word only vaguely pertaining to a place he'd been born. Did he get his name from Legion or elsewhere? All he knew, and all he even cared to know, was that his name meant nothing relevant. He could only truly remember that his name had something to do with the tiny decrepit airstrip he was born on or near, a part of a sky vehicle or something equally irrelevant, but at least serving as an adequate means of being addressed. Although, for the life of him, he could not remember if he was allowed to keep his name, or if the name was given to him at a Legion boys' camp near an old air vehicle. Either way, none of that mattered to him, and one way or another, he was born with his name that had no true meaning. Born in a non-existent tribe, or born in the Legion's fire, neither was relevant when the present was all there is. Still, something inside him wanted to know where names came from as he told her flatly, "Sit down and tell me the story," and resumed his recollection of the day, creeping closer towards his observance of the nameless giant. At that, the slave sat back down hesitantly and started with only a slight shake in her voice. "It's been so long, but I will do as master." The decanus was finally thinking about the evening and walking towards the sign where he awaited the last round of captives to fall from those cliffs, but more importantly, waiting for that last arrow to hit the sign. Aileron caught fragments of the slave's story, but was more focused on running through each individual action he'd done that evening. Every breath he took, every gust of wind he felt, everything he saw, the glow of fires across the siege line, and the sight of shadows shuffling about in the suffering village below. He caught only part of Gabriella's opening. "My sister was named after her, and I was named after the sister." He loved that woman so much and only had eyes for her even as the world moved further and further towards war. Aileron only subconsciously took in the story as he thought about Dalton the Prime eventually stepping up and taking in the sight. Dalton had mentioned something about the Interfector's explorer bringing some intel back from Long Shadows, and how he had to take part in one of the clifftop executions earlier that day. Alaron couldn't recall exactly what the words Dalton said were, but remembered being interrupted a few seconds later, when their attention turned to the protruding rocks where those executions were always done. The necks of the surrendered warriors were opened, and the bodies shoved off the ledge into the darkness. The war came, and the world was consumed by it. Everything and everyone's lives were forever changed, especially theirs. The young Decanus watched those last bodies fall from the cliffs, and turned to the sign of surrender just in time to see the arrow land right in the middle of the O in the word. Mortiacar, roughly meaning, to be spared. He had answered the call of war, and his tribe sent its warriors to the north. Alaron thought about the glows of the fire across the line as that arrow continued to wobble to a halt, and recalled the faint smell of the dead, an odor that had drifted up from the village more and more throughout the days of starving them out. He was so in love with her, but he couldn't be with her because the war was all he wanted. He got what he wanted, but left her, his heart at home. He couldn't leave. War became all he knew, and it became all he would ever be. This slowly killed him because he still missed his heart, but the war had already claimed him. Years in the ruined village had taken his soul, and the sun never shined again as the poisons of the dead world all around became forever part of him. He remembered Dalton tap him on the shoulder and head off to tell Lord Interfector about the last arrow, and recalled turning to see the Hydebark shadows hauling one of their dead or injured to the enclosure. When he was allowed to go home, he reunited with his heart again. She loved him despite being gone for so long, and even though he wore the visible and invisible scars of battle, war was still all he could see, but not even that could stop her love from breaking through. He was her, and she was him. Alaron had finally reached the last part of his night. He saw that giant with the axe and bow pacing back and forth in the same general spot he'd been for days, slapping the axe into the earth, and yanking it out to do it again and again, until it was time to pace to and fro again, on a continuous loop. The war never left him. War was still all there was in the world around them. Together, they were love, but the world of war outside had pulled them apart before. No matter how beautiful they were together, the scars all over his body and inside his soul from so much terror were always fated to return. The Decanus remembered the giant swinging away at the earth, right on the edge of the fire's glow, where the light met the darkness. No amount of swinging would keep the darkness away as that fire continued to burn its faint light behind him. Alaron recalled the giant finally snapping his bow and leaving that spot where he stood for days. And then the war pulled them apart for the last time. The world was destroyed and had taken her beauty and spirit in the great fire. He thought he could be happy with her forever, but when he became the symbol of war, and it came back, it took her from the world for good, and now he walks the wastes. Alaron lifted his head at her sudden stop, but his attention was pulled to the mouth of the tent by the sound of someone hastily entering. It was Dalton the Prime who'd entered helmet in hand saying, "Alaron, grab your stuff, there's something going on in the village." The young Decanus leaped out of his cot and threw on his armor in a flash, leaving the slave sitting right where she was before he entered. As Alaron stormed out of the tent with the Prime, he did so thinking about a man who was called to war, became it, and thought love and peace could change who he was, only for war to return and remove everything else from the earth. As Alaron stepped up to the line of barricades overlooking the village, more Legion forces congregated along their sections of the line. Alaron saw Montano leave his tent with Gula, and meet with Theracos as they approached, until his attention was turned to the Interfector emerging from his with Dalton in tow. The elite started asking a different Centurion some questions that got buried by the noise of the camp activity. Alaron saw as Montano and the other staff of the Six stepped up to their barricade. He suddenly heard the approaching Interfector asking whether Caesar knew what was happening, or if he should fetch him. Alaron, as well as everyone else's attention, was immediately turned to the village upon hearing a loud series of piercing wails coming from the people. There they saw distant shadows hastily moving about down below, with that fire in the middle now completely unattended and beginning to die. For several long moments, the line was filled, but less was seen below, and no new orders came. All eyes of everyone under the bull were fixed on that village as the fire died, leaving everyone to wonder what was happening or waiting for orders to move. The crying continued neither louder nor quieter, until that lone fire in the camp flickered out of existence, and Aileron thought of what he'd heard from his servant and everything he'd seen throughout the day and current night. The last arrow of defiance had been fired, and nothing changed. War darkens everyone and everything, and when the fire dies, the defiance is gone and darkness wins, but the suffering continues. When that darkness takes away all innocence, it leaves the charred man behind in a torn world to join it, or start the fire again. Every set of Legion eyes watching the darkness-shrouded village and hearing those wails knew that the only logical choice in the world was to join the darkness. Carnifex. The Legion forces waited atop the line for several more hours, with nothing happening in the village below, beside the wailing shrinking below the winds. No counterattack, no action from the Hydebarks. The line sat silently waiting for dawn to come and reveal what happened below. Caesar himself heard word of the mysterious incident as the line was filled. The elite came to report the alert, but was sent away by being told this was expected. Every legionary watched the darkness for a long time, waiting to act or waiting for some last-ditch effort from the besieged. Again, nothing happened, and the dictator requested to be left alone until morning. Still, the line waited. Hours passed, and the whole force sat at the ready until just before the first glimmer of dawn over the east. Right before the glow began to claim the night, the fire in the middle of the village was started again, but it was no longer the giant standing there with his axe and bow. Instead, it was a lone male, waving a blank flag back and forth. With the fire showing the white flag, dawn had broken over the east, the dictator was informed, and all veterans of the cohort were ordered forth. As the sun rose more and more, the veteran legionaries marched down the steep and winding paths into the cliff-lined little valley unopposed, and into the village proper. There, Montano stepped up to the site of the lone fire that was quickly extinguished, as the force of nearly 80 veterans fanned out across the village to begin rooting out the shattered Hydebark people, most of whom were too hungry to put up any kind of resistance. Montano turned back to the cliffs he came from and saw the great sign completely legible, even from such a distance, and studied the broken fragments of the giant's bow that had been snapped after the 30th arrow. Upon glancing back at the cliffs, he saw the outline of a sizable formation, marking the guards and staff of both Caesar and the elite. People were hauled out of their battered homes and rounded up by the veterans, as last night's uproar of wails became the signature sound of the morning as well. As more were hauled into the open by the cohort's veterans, Montano himself was approached by a Hydebark male who held the rolled-up white flag. The man's face was bloody and beaten, staring at the masked Decanus with a face that said he was more than willing to fight if he wasn't holding that flag. But the strange part was how the tribal's face said something else. That something else was the telepathic order for Montano to follow him. Montano gave a nod to the savage but temporarily tamed man and signaled for his group of veterans to follow. Montano followed the flag-carrying man on a short walk from the central fire to the largest tent structure made of animal hides and desert debris. Montano did not expect a trap as he followed the man inside the tent, due to the force continuing their work outside and state of the broken Hydebark people. Upon ducking under the structure's opening to accommodate the large flag mounted to his back, Montano studied the scene as his contingent of soldiers filed in behind him. Laying before Montano was a terrible display. On the far end of the enclosure sat a large chair or makeshift throne with a decapitated man still sitting in it, and two other smaller seats beside it, both also occupied by deceased men who were impaled to their chairs by long wooden rods, and with heads hanging low, barely holding up the elaborate tribal headdresses atop their bleeding heads. The far end of the enclosure didn't capture his attention for long, because seated in the middle of the large tent was an even worse scene. The lone giant laid there sprawled out in the center in a pool of blood, and surrounding the giant's body were over a dozen men, laying mutilated and lifeless. Weapons were scattered about, and limbs were laying wherever there wasn't blood, and 6 other Hydebark warriors were seated off to one side treating wounds and groaning in agony. Montano removed his goggles and looked to the Hydebark flag-bearer. After taking in the mess and locking eyes with the only Hyde-Bark standing, the tribal said in accent, "No one's left to say it. We surrender." Montano exited the tent with the official word, and after finally witnessing the scene of the incident that apparently caused their surrender, the survivors of the massacre as well as their flag bearer were escorted out of the chieftain's tent in custody of the veterans to the growing congregation of captures. More and more captives were escorted to their assigned sections for the start of assessment, and the process continued until Montano sent a runner up the cliffs to inform the elite and Caesar about what happened. Upon hearing the message, the Interfector and his staff came down the cliffs to join the assimilation work, and the elite personally entered the site of the massacre, marveling at what happened. It is unknown whether this was out of curiosity or respect of some sort, but the Interfector personally saw that the massacre was cleaned up, and the body of the giant was brought out into the open to be burned with the other corpses as the Hyde-Bark weeping continued. Before a team of 5 legionaries threw the giant's body onto the corpse piles, the Interfector took a moment to study the beast laying there, surrounded by the dozen men he apparently killed, and looking at the damage. The only way he could describe the face of the monster was gone. A bloody and mangled object sat on the shoulders of the giant, and many who saw the face wondered if it was always caked in blood, or if this was just something that happened the previous night, since not many actually got to see the lone occasion he came close enough to clearly observe. As the 5 legionaries began to pick up the body, the elite was still studying it, and just before the soldiers lifted him up, he saw a puff of hot breath come from what he assumed was the monster's mouth, and visibly enter the morning cold. Immediately, the Interfector sent a runner up the cliff to inform Caesar about the state of the monster. The messenger reached the top as more Hyde-Bark succumbed to the veterans' abuse after days of starvation and dehydration, but the formation of Praetorians atop the ridge never moved. Still, the runner returned to the elite, and the only response from the dictator himself were the words, "Bring him to me." 2 days later, the camp below was destroyed and leveled. Of the 400 Hyde-Barks who occupied the village, only around half of them survived the siege and initial assessment by the Legion victors. The only thing that didn't account for were the mass of surrendered warriors who'd lost before the siege even began. After those 60-plus warriors were sacrificed as incentive to surrender, there were still over 60 left. But where they ended up was a mystery to all when they found themselves kneeling in a formation before the tent of Caesar himself. Each former Hyde-Bark warrior, including almost all males from the village, were bound and gagged with a single veteran legionary or officer of the cohort standing behind them. Both Aileron and Montano were in the formation, looking down at the captives before them, standing before Caesar's tent, and waiting for the next directive. The wind had slowed to a halt when the elite exited the dictator's domicile first, quickly followed by the entire Praetorian staff who formed a crescent before the entrance. Then, the doctor emerged, apparently suffering from several more bruises on his face, and taking his place next to the elite, who subtly handed him a sack of some sort the doctor hesitantly accepted. Caesar himself finally emerged from the tent, and immediately behind the Lord exited a giant human with a face completely wrapped by bandages still seeping blood into the white cloth. Caesar stood before the formation and said something to the giant with a gesture towards the silent mass of legionaries and restrained Hyde-Bark males. Nobody could hear what Caesar said, especially Aileron and Montano, who stood in the back with other staff officers, but the gesture was apparently displaying the formation as an offer to the beast. Without any word, the bandage-masked beast walked over to the first restrained man in the formation. Aileron could see this first man because of the spacing in the line, and watched the decanus put the blade to his captive's neck, only for the beast to crank the machete from the man's grip and remove the captive's head in one swing. The headless man collapsed to the dirt. The decanus, now captiveless, stood back to attention. Other captures began to struggle, and the monster moved to the next man in the line. One by one, the Hyde-Bark monster destroyed the men and warriors he fought so viciously to protect, and more captures struggled in their restraints while the beast mechanically moved further down the line and into the next ranks, taking lives with him after each stop. Some captive warriors struggled the best they could, But their effort was futile, with their arms chained to their legs, and with a legionary officer standing behind them fully intent and ready to kill if needed. As each man fell, and more were killed by the beast in their helpless states, many of the captives began sobbing or praying for a salvation that wouldn't come in this life. When the beast stood before Montano, Montano studied his completely wrapped face and marveled at the fact there weren't even any eye holes in the mask. The blood still poured even more into the bandages as hot air escaped the mask into the cold, breathing heavily, wheezing, and looking over each and every hide bar capture with that faceless face before indulging in the messy task. Montano's captive was resigned to his fate, even going so far as looking right back at the bleeding mask the monster wore. When the monster glanced upward at Montano, he saw that the Legion soldier was offering his blade for the deed. The monster only responded by letting loose another terrible wheezing sound and proceeded to twist the neck of the captive until it was looking back at Montano's groin, eyes bulging and lifeless. Montano sheathed his blade, and the monster gave a few heavy breaths as the faceless wrapping seemed to look him over for a couple of seconds. The giant then moved down the line. Aileron was one of the last ones in the formation, and his captive had been sobbing at the start, but by the time the monster was in front of him, the captive was barely conscious, being held up only by Aileron's grip on the man's hair. The beast stopped in front of Aileron, only briefly looking at the state of the captive before seeming to intently study Aileron himself. Aileron reached to offer his blade to the monster as well with his free hand before being stopped by a nightmare-inducing grunt from the beast and several breaths that sounded unbearably painful. Despite whatever terrible pain the monster was in, he was still the embodiment of pain's infliction, not its victim. In a single motion, the hide-bark giant swatted Aileron's hand from the captive's head. Aileron released his grip, and the man collapsed unconscious to the dirt. The beast then stared at Aileron again as even more blood began to seep through the bandage mask until he looked down. Perhaps Aileron's captive thought playing dead or being legitimately scared into unconsciousness would save him. We will never know that man's mindset, since the hide-bark beast then began to stomp on the captive's skull with his large boot until there was nothing left, and moved wordlessly on to the last doomed men. Neither Aileron, Montano, or any legionary were alone in what they saw after the monster moved down the line. After each legionary watched their captives fall to the giant, they came to the attention and looked straight ahead. Being in the center back of the formation, Aileron and Montano saw what many others saw. They saw the look on the dictator's face grow subtly more proud as each man fell to the monster's violence. When the last man was slaughtered, the beast stormed through the ranks, shoving past the legionaries at attention and even past Caesar back into the Lord's tent. Caesar ordered the elite to approach. The doctor was ordered into the dictator's tent, and Caesar spoke with the elite for a few moments. When they were done, Caesar re-entered his domicile, and the elite dismissed the formation with orders for centurions and their immediate staff to stay behind. When dismissed, many of the lower legionaries went about cleaning up the nearly 100 corpse mess, or went to swap shifts over the packed prisoner pens, now free of all men. As the minutes went on, no word or change came from Caesar's tent as 6 Praetorian sentries outside stood watch. When the centurions and staff of the 4th cohort stepped up to the Interfector, he requested his standard unit readiness reports from the centurions and took input from the staff when necessary. The meeting went on like any other, without even mentioning the mass execution or the hide-bark giant's involvement, even as the scene was cleaned up around them. It was like nothing happened, one more tally on Caesar's list of the conquered, and nothing more. When Centurion Lucania finally inquired about the event every officer under the 4th cohort participated in, and the involvement of the giant, the elite did not answer. Instead, the murderer of Phoenix gave a simple order. "Let's pack this place up. Devil dogs are up next."